everybody knows they're going to die, but everybody acts like they're going to live forever. The amount of time that we're going to spend incarnate in a physical body is probably much, much less than the amount of time that we're going to spend between death and rebirth in the spiritual world. So we should understand non-physical realities. Developing clairvoyance is like a highly controlled form of psychosis, and you have to be very careful of it because you don't want to become a mental patient perceiving all kinds of phantasmagoric non-physical beings around you all the time, and these beings told me to do this. That could become extremely dysfunctional. Our suffering is hollowing us out with sharp knives to create a space inside of us that can be filled with joy later. There are certain types of astral remedies. Some of it is working at the vibrational level that can help us in dealing with whatever that challenge is. The key astral remedy is... sometimes when people look at my body of work, they're like, how do these different things fit together? The sacred geometry, the biohacking, the vibrational activation, the consciousness activation, the work in Egyptian biogeometry, my background in the military and the nuclear, biological, chemical warfare survival field, my PhD in international studies. It's like, how does all this fit together? But in my mind, it's all part of one piece. And I think if I was to express what my spiritual purpose is, my mission in its largest terms, it really is about something related to the Rosicrucian initiation saying, which was, in the beginning was the memory. And so what that really means, in the beginning was the memory, is that in every lifetime when we incarnate, classically they would say that we take the draft of forgetfulness, where we forget about our past incarnations, we forget about who am I, why am I here, what did I come to do in this incarnation, and we all undertake this kind of hero's journey to reclaim ourselves, to reclaim our larger karmic memory, to reclaim our purpose in life. And so, particularly in a very materialistic culture like we have today, it's very easy to get lost. And so I find many people today are having a very difficult time being able to find an orientation to having a healthy balance between the inner and the outer life, and really reconnecting to the purpose for being here. And so my purpose writ large is really do whatever I can to help people remember, who am I, why am I here, and what did I incarnate to do in this incarnation? Because life is a limited time opportunity, as I like to say, and we should be taking the best advantage of the time that we're given, both for our own personal evolution, and not only personal healing, but also being activated to a higher state, being able to stabilize that, so it's something we can hold on to even past the gate of death and into the next incarnation. And so that we're being able to provide service to other people while also being able to live our best lives and being on the track for the things that are the most enriching for us, to have a life that's very powerful, very joyous, really optimizing what it is that we would like, where we're also providing the highest level of service. So for me, that's really the core of it. But then all the different pieces come in, so that, for example, we have the aspect that in the work of the Vesica Institute, which is the institute I founded 20-odd years ago, we have what we call spiritual science and what we call vibrational science. And in the vibrational science realm, we also have an aspect that we call SEER, for subtle energy explorations and research, that essentially we have the aspect in the human being that we have our consciousness states, and then we have the energy body that supports it. You can have a very strong energy body, but if you haven't developed your consciousness, your life will still be a shambles and you're not going to find any fulfillment. And the other way around, if you've worked on your consciousness, but you don't have a good foundation in the energetic body, you have nothing to support it, and it will end up collapsing. And so this is something that we find then contained in the Himalayan tradition, where they discuss, for example, Shiva and Shakti. So you have ultimate consciousness and you have ultimate energy. Well, every human being has that microcosm within them. And so to make this hero's journey that we're all on as exciting and pleasurable as possible, to be able to actually not just have an intellectual understanding of things, although that's very important, but to have direct experience and to directly explore the application of practices for higher consciousness and to activate and stabilize the energy body that will support that consciousness, and so that we're having a good time in the dense vehicle of the physical body rather than it being some heavy weight we have to drag around and a vehicle for just potential suffering. It's very important to take care of that as well. So that's a general introduction to a few ideas.
And you've gone ahead and expanded. I love, well, there's two questions that emerged from me, so I've got to pick one, don't I? I wanted to ask about your take on how it differs from traditional, like people's traditional understanding of what Rosicrucians are, as opposed to how you look at it. But I think at this particular juncture, more pertinent is discussing the energy body and the subtle body. And we actually, well, do we kind of, or do we exist across 7 planes? And maybe you can describe the 7 planes to us.
Right. So what you'll find in multiple traditions, this is something that I address in my first level spiritual science online course, Essential Teachings and Practices of Spiritual Science, is that if you look at different traditions, they have different ways of dividing the different planes of existence, which then get reflected into our own subtle bodies. So the first thing we need to understand is, though different traditions may divide the levels into different numbers of levels for analysis and understanding, we always have the aspect that if we look at a human being having subtle bodies, everything in existence has to come from somewhere. And following the core principle of the microcosm as a reflection of the macrocosm, one of those original classic Egyptian Hermetic teachings, as above, so below, as within, so without, the whole relationship between macrocosm and microcosm, if we talk about a human being having a physical body, it has to come from somewhere. And that's why in the Himalayan tradition, they discuss the physical body as the kosha, or the sheath, that is the sheath made of food, because the food our mother takes in while they're gestating us in their womb, and then the food that we take in once we're an independent being, that gets converted into the physical body. So we take part of the physical substance from outside of ourselves, and then we turn that into our actual physical body, our sheath for being able to manifest, literally materialize on the physical plane. Crystallizing into matter is one way to look at it. But of course, the physical body would be nothing but a dead lump if it was not activated by core life energy. And one of the modern tragedies is that in the Western world, they threw out every idea of life energy that existed in every classical tradition and acts like we're just some type of biological accident that operates like a machine with no understanding and not even permitting the discussion of the idea of life energy. Whereas in every classical tradition, life energy was not only the foundation of a lot of our personal development, it was also the foundation of all healing systems. So if you throw that out of all modern healing in the Western model, you've lost something very essential. And so above the physical body, we have the life energy. So they call that chi in China, or prana in India, ether by the Greeks. And so this is that dynamic life force that actually animates the physical body. It's what in Chinese medicine they would call our taking the universal chi field and then individualizing it into our life energy. In the ancient Egyptian tradition, they would represent this by showing a neter, a higher being that's a conscious force of nature, called Khnum, who has a ram's head, is sitting at a potter's wheel, and he is on the potter's wheel forming what they call the Ka, which is the life body of a human being, that when that gets inserted in the physical body will make it alive and animated. So this understanding of the life energy and that it is taken from a larger field of life energy all around us is something that's really universal. So whether you call it chi, ki, prana, ether, or something else, it's all the same idea, but it's what actually gives us life. And it is what creates and sustains the physical body. And it is going to be the difference between whether your life in a physical body is a misery or it's a constant pleasure. So working with the dynamic life force is absolutely vital. Then above that, we start working into the bodies of consciousness. Now, again, different traditions will give different higher levels of consciousness, different names. They'll divide them slightly different ways. In the Western system, the first level is going to be called the astral. And so the term astral is coming from the root term aster, meaning a star. So what is a star? It is a source of light in the darkness. And so whereas when you're experiencing yourself in the etheric life body, you experience that in terms of vibration, tingling, pressure, density, hot and cold, things like this. When you are experiencing the first level of the consciousness body, then this is expressed in terms of light and color. And so that's the reason why it's called the astral body. It's a source of light. And then the different colors in the astral body are reflecting things that are going on with the creation of our thought forms and the activity of our mind and the activity of our emotions, which are all powerful, functional energies that come from a higher level. And so that first level, the astral, even in the Western tradition, this term is sometimes used in slightly different ways. In some traditions, they'll use the term astral to mean the very first level of the consciousness body, which we might also call the emotional body. It's where our emotions exist, and it is a part of our soul life. But in other cases, they'll use the term astral to mean both the emotional body and the mental body as they come together, because they're very tightly connected. So what your emotional state is will definitely affect your thought forms, and your thought forms of how you internalize what's happening to you, depending on how you take that in and interpret it, that will affect your emotional state. So they're constantly interacting together. So then we have the astral level, and if we say that it is primarily the emotional rather than emotional and mental, then we'd have another mental level above it. And then at the next level, again, using the most common Western model today, and there are differences in different traditions, but it's like a cake. You could slice it into as many different slices as you want for analysis. We want to have enough so that we can differentiate things, but not so many that it becomes unworkable. So above that level of the mental body, we then have what in, again, the common Western model today that was popularized by the Theosophists, we have the causal body. And so the causal body is really where we are connected to our karma, the law of cause and effect. What we are sending out, we're going to get back. And so at the causal level, this is also connected to certain types of energetic blueprints of everything that will exist in the world, because it's going to be the cause behind the effect of crystallization into all of the lower levels. So there are literal sacred geometry blueprints existing at this level, including the blueprint of our own subtle body structure that we have created by how we've used our mind and our emotions and our actions, thought, speech, and action for the Buddhist, thinking, feeling, and willing for the Rosicrucians, etc. So there's the causal level. Then above that, we have what we might call in the West the spiritual level. And the spiritual level is the world of true spiritual beings and all the different spiritual beings that exist, and ourselves as a spiritual being, all of which are fragments or emanations of pieces of particular powers or actions from the One, the Godhead, which is at the top level, the divine plane level. And we all exist on the divine plane level, but the thing is most people are not aware of ourselves at the divine plane level. We may be conscious of myself in my physical body. I can feel I'm here. I can feel myself in my energy body. I feel tired today. I feel strong today. Whatever it is I feel energetically. then I can look at and experience what I have in my emotions at a particular time, what thought forms I'm generating, what I'm thinking about, whether that's more beneficial or detrimental in my perspective, etc. We can experience these things, but for the majority of people, they're not conscious that the part of them is always on the divine plane. So if you say a person has 7 bodies, one of those bodies is the divine body, and that divine body is always operating on the divine plane. But most people are not conscious of it. We're separate from it. And so in many classical traditions, there'd be methods to make ourselves more aware of ourselves on the divine plane, to make a link to that.
Remember, draft of forgetfulness.
Exactly. And so that, in Western terms, would then be a path to becoming a saint. A saint is someone who's always aware of themselves on the divine plane level. Now, one of the practical aspects of what that means, because that could sound kind of highfalutin and, okay, I'm aware of myself on the divine plane level, what's that? One very direct aspect of that is we become aware that we are an emanation, along with everybody and everything else, from the one original, what in modern physics they'd call the unified field. Everything was part of one consciousness. And we all feel this subconscious pull to want to get back to that. We want to reunite back to the one. Now that tends to microcosmically reflect in our romantic yearnings, that we want to find the missing part of ourselves, the person that'll make us complete, to be able to have the two combined back into one. Because we know what that state of unity is like. And although we can enjoy and should explore our independence as a separate being, nonetheless, very deeply buried in every person's heart is that desire to have the lover, the partner that we reconnect to, we become one, we're truly known by them, we truly know them, and when we're together with them, we don't know where we end and they begin. It's like the fields unify, because in the physical body, we're always going to be separate. That's the nature of the physical plane. But at these higher energetic levels, energy bodies can interpenetrate, and at the divine plane level, everything is one.
Alrighty, guys, hopefully you're having your mind blown by this podcast with Robert J. Gilbert. I know mine's just, and it's only about to get more mind-blowing. Do us a favor, please hit subscribe to the channel. It enables us to get more and more guests like Dr. Robert J. Gilbert onto the podcast. His wisdom's incredibly insightful. The type of guest that we get on the show is completely powered by your subscription. Please do take a moment to hit subscribe to the channel. Without too much further ado, back to today's episode.
So if I was to give another anecdote about this, so that's like the basic 7 planes model in a very rough form. And so when we're at the divine plane level, this can also have ramifications for our perceptions as we begin to open up our organs of direct spiritual perception. Now, Rudolf Steiner, the great Rosicrucian teacher, said at one time that developing clairvoyance is like a highly controlled form of psychosis. Now, that means that it's somewhat fraught, and you have to be very careful of it, because you don't want to become a mental patient and you're perceiving all kinds of phantasmagoric, non-physical beings around you all the time, and these beings told me to do this, and that could become extremely dysfunctional. These are like failed forms of spiritual initiation. There's millions of mentally ill people around the world that had a type of failed spiritual initiation, and they're perceiving all kinds of wild beings and messages, and they can't make any sense out of it. They don't have a solid boundary to be able to make an order out of it and work with it in a responsible way. But one thing that when you do start opening up to perceive non-physical beings, non-physical realities, these higher planes of existence, of which the physical plane is just the tip of the iceberg, it's a very small part of the whole system, then we can perceive things like we might experience some being on a higher level that we're directly perceiving that appears to be one great, amazing spiritual being. But then we can perceive that other beings are starting to separate out of it. And we begin to realize that it was actually, and I'll give credit here to one of my teachers, who was the French medical doctor Samuel Sagan at the Clairvision School of Australia. And he developed the great term combinescence. And he said that at these higher levels, combinescence, combined essence, is possible. And the beings can combine together to what looks like one being. So they have this great secret of being able to be both independent, but to join back into the one when they choose to. And so you'll find that all these higher beings could actually combine into one great being or separate back out for independent action when they choose to. And so we can understand that better when we understand the nature that we all come from the one and we all go back to the one. And it is possible to combine energetically in much deeper ways than is possible in the physical body.
There seems to be a lot of fear because around generally opening up to unseen forces, unseen beings, unseen support from other realms and dimensions, and maybe Hollywood has a part to play.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking of Stranger Things as a show.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
wow, it can get really dark really fast. Touch wood, and I would love to sort of just feel into your awareness on that, because I think we do have a lot of fear, but I imagine there are a lot of forces at play that are consistently also supporting us on our journey. And a part two to that question, also, one of the things that completely blew me away is researching your work, this idea of strengthening our spiritual muscles, if in need of a better word, and realizing that, well, worth sort of unpacking a little bit. I know it's a long question, but in the West, we've sort of conflated satanic forces and Luciferic forces to be one.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some issues with that, because then we sort of just the good path, the bad path, but then understanding the nature of the forces that are sort of distracting us on our path can be quite important. And I just found Luciferic forces quite interesting, and also satanic forces, and also what you were saying before, like the world is overly materialistic. I should probably pause here and let you give a response to all of this. And how do we learn to trust the unseen forces and open ourselves up to them?
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate the question. It leads to some really wonderful areas to explore. So one part of it is that we have to be aware of the evolution of consciousness, that in ancient times, like if you go back to the ancient Vedic, Vedantic text, you'll see glimpses of a time when people directly perceive non-physical beings and realities all the time. But what happened over time in the evolution of human consciousness, partly linked to what in the Indian tradition is described as the cycle of the four yugas, or these four great ages that we go to as we entered into what they call the Dark Age, Kali Yuga, then we had this aspect that we lost our direct perception of non-physical realities. And that was necessary for a stage of an alchemical process. And so this alchemical process in which we develop our consciousness to a higher level, we began just like as a reflection of the old state of being in the divine, we're all one, that we had a consciousness that the most important thing to us was our tribal identity. And so like in Greece, if somebody did something horrible, then the worst fate you could have was to be kicked out of the city and kicked out of your group. Today, if we get in legal trouble, rather than go to prison for 40 years, I said, well, we'll kick you out of the city. Otherwise, they'll say, fine, I'm leaving. I don't care. But back in the old days, it was a huge thing. Like to be separated from your group, that was a loss of self to do that. What am I going to do now? But as we evolved our consciousness, we lost direct perception of non-physical realities so that we could focus and really sharpen our physical senses to perceive the physical plane much more deeply, and to be able to go more deeply into the functioning of our physical brain to be able to create what we think of today as modern science, for example. So our knowledge today of the material plane far exceeds what we ever had in the past, because that's what we're totally focused on, and we're able to use analytical capacities in the brain that didn't exist the same way a long time ago. But we lost all of these spiritual aspects, including direct perception of spirit, as a part of that process. Also, as we began to separate from the spiritual world as part of a spiritual growth process, we also had the aspect that was inevitable, that we would become more separate from other people. We'd feel more separate from our group, from our tribe. We'd be more capable of independent action. And our primary focus would always be ourselves as an independent agent rather than the group identity. Now, of course, that's gotten to the point today that it's led to not just being a healthy form of being able to be independent, and non-dependent on others, but it's actually become a type of toxic narcissism that we see everywhere today. And
Very
so
prevalent.
that's what happens when it becomes one-sided and becomes toxic over time. So in this particular process that we went through, once we lost the direct perception and understanding of non-physical realities, in earlier times, people had no fear of perceiving these non-physical realities. It was just like seeing anything else around you. But as we began to lose an understanding of it, then we became more dependent upon spiritual religious organizations that would then tell us what spiritual reality was about because we couldn't see it for ourselves anymore. And inevitably, in these organizations, it went from having a priesthood that actually could perceive and understand these things, so they were telling us something true, to instead just becoming a frozen body of dogma that the people giving it to us couldn't perceive anything themselves and are even themselves more materialistically interpreting all of these things. And that also then led to frightening people into doing what those authority structures wanted you to do by making you very afraid of non-physical things. And so all those boogeymen would come to get you. Now, the thing is, originally, when these boogeymen were talked about in spiritual sources, there was the understanding that these things actually do exist. But it's something similar to if you said to a person, you have 1 billion bacteria in your body right now. And yeah, it's true. They got 1 billion bacteria in their body right now. But some of those bacteria they couldn't live without. It's the microbiome. You better have those things. And some of them are pathological, but as long as you have your basic health state, it doesn't really lead to anything too terrible. So it became a manipulation thing to get people very afraid of non-physical realities, but we'll keep you safe. You have to pray to our God, and you have to do this, and you have to do that, and don't step outside the lines. We'll tell you what's acceptable in any area, otherwise God will punish you, and those beings will get you. These kinds of things developed. This is an oversimplification, but that's kind of the gist of it. Now, also connected with this was that simply by losing understanding of higher realities, it's easy to become afraid of something we don't understand. And that also happened. Now, by the time we get to modern times and modern media, modern entertainment, it got to the point that the people writing the scripts, this is what I consider to be the biggest problem, like in Hollywood right now. They got a lot of great actors. They got a lot of great directors. They got people that can put together amazing movies. The problem, by and large, is writing. And so the writing is often not very good. And people are starting to complain about it, and that's why Hollywood's kind of going down the tubes right now. It's because the writing's not very good. Now, I'm not saying that's true across the board. There's some fantastic writers out there, but the quality of writing is not great. So whereas in reality, people are waking up to the reality of spirit, of being a spiritual being, working to find a workable path today to really integrating that for a path of growth that is real and progressive and cumulative, that you can take past the gate of death, something real. Then when we get reflections about spiritual reality in our modern media entertainment, because you referenced this a moment ago, often because the writers don't know anything about it whatsoever, it becomes like a horror movie. So if they're dealing with things that are spiritual, it's ghosts and demons and all these horrible, grotesque things that are going to afflict you. And because that's pretty easy to write. And
More fear.
it doesn't require a high state of consciousness to write that type of thing. But again, it's a tragedy because people don't understand real spiritual reality because of this incredibly one-sided, caricatured representation of everything non-physical and spiritual as something grotesque and weird and scary and dangerous. So those things do exist, but if we don't have a primary focus on the beneficial and the essential and the beautiful, then it's going to be something toxic, and that's kind of what it's become. And this is a real problem today because people are reading much less. They're getting their information mostly from video sources, like the work that both of us do, and getting information out through video. and through entertainment, things like this. So I wanted to address that one point of it to begin with that you had brought up about, people are scared of this. So the fear of it is something that would happen automatically to a certain extent once you lose any understanding or perception of it. But it's really amplified by the manipulations of unethical religious structures trying to manipulate you to doing what they want you to do, and also by how it's represented in a culture where the people creating the entertainment know nothing, understand nothing about this. I had a person recently, a very nice fellow who's working in Hollywood doing scripts and things, who approached me to see if I could help with the spiritual aspects of a particular script. And I'm hoping that in the future I can get more involved in that to say, the way this is being represented is something that's really grotesque and skewed, and it's not going to lead anybody to understanding spirituality at a deeper level. Let's find a way to represent real spiritual reality, and that will excite people. Why did something like Harry Potter become this huge thing, however many years ago it was now, like 20 years or something? Why did that get so huge? And it's because it dealt with something that, even though it was like kind of in a kid's format, that interests and excites people. And so we see that anytime there's even a little breath of something spiritual that has any integrity, people get really excited about it. The same thing with Star Wars. Not a super deep philosophical treatise, but just the idea that there was a force back in the 1970s and you could connect to it and do these things was like amazing to people. Like, so great. And they became these Star Wars fanatics. Again, a limited access point for understanding deeper reality, but at least there was something there that attracts people. So what we need to have today is we need to have just a clear, rational, grounded understanding of non-physical realities that we are simply a crystallization of. The amount of time that we're going to spend incarnate in a physical body is probably much, much less than the amount of time that we're going to spend between death and rebirth in the spiritual world. So we should understand non-physical realities. Now, this also is connected to we need to understand what the practices are to be able to structure our own subtle body, to activate the nascent organs of spiritual perception inside of ourselves, to be able to perceive and understand these things again. Because once you go past the gate of death, there's the kind of classical saying, and this is also related to some Indian teaching stories, about one of the great mysteries of the world is that everybody knows they're going to die, but everybody acts like they're going to live forever.
Hey, you're Inspired Tribe. I want to take a quick sec. I wanted to share something today with you that is really dear to my heart, and it's actually what keeps the entire ecosystem around the Inspired Evolution thriving, my one-on-one coaching. So it's basically coaching that helps you live a spiritually aligned life. I coach people from all different types of walks of life. These people are leaders and they're looking to have an incredible spiritual impact in the lives that they're leading for themselves, and then also lead in alignment to their values. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a few people that have also transformed through my coaching, and here's what they have to say.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines. And
he's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing.
Then my corporate banking job wasn't really doing it.
You feel like you're not making progress towards your goals.
And Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
I'm more in control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate because you won't be disappointed.
As you guys can see, there's a lot of people all over the world from all these different corners experiencing incredible transformations. I don't think, if I can say humbly myself, that there is anything quite like this somewhere else online. Most people that, have channels that, grow and grow and grow don't really focus on one-to-one offerings. I have just found that it is the most profound space where you can bring yourself in a private container and really just share what's going on for yourself. And if you want to book in for that call with me, touch base, it's www.amrit.com. amrit.coach/life. That's www.amrit.coach/life. There is a link in the show notes below to book in that call. And yeah, if you want to take your journey further, if you want to dive in deeper, and you really want to live a spiritually aligned life, if it's for you, please do check it out. And without too much further ado, once again, for your spirit, for yourself, today's podcast.
You know, we should have that sense of memento mori, that remember you will die. You have limited time. Life is a limited time opportunity. And if you don't activate those organs of spiritual perception, if you don't structure your subtle body here and now, you're not going to have anything to take with you. It's like somebody said, I'm going to take a trip to Britain in 2 years, but I don't have any money. Say, okay, we got 2 years to make some money, so when you go to Britain, you can do some stuff. Well, it's kind of the same thing here. You know you're going to die. What have you done to invest into your account that you can actually function and perceive and take action and navigate in a world without a physical body and without the five senses? Now, people don't tend to think about this, but this is absolutely essential. This was understood in all the ancient traditions. People knew I need to spend my time here, at least part of it, developing these organs of spiritual perception and structuring my subtle body. And that became the practices you found in all the classical spiritual traditions. As time went on, and many traditions themselves just became control structures and understood very little about spiritual reality, they didn't really have people focus on those spiritual practices anymore. They would just provide service to whatever that authority structure was. And so this is something that needs to come back into culture, and in a free way, not like I'm going to have to follow this religious authority. But this goes into then answering your question earlier about Rosicrucianism. And so my take on Rosicrucianism is that, number one, Rosicrucianism is not some separate, isolated thing from the rest of the world. It is the modern appearance of the Western spiritual tradition in its modern updated form. Before that, it had existed in ancient Egypt. It existed amongst the Essenes. It existed amongst the Greeks. It existed in the European traditions. And by the time we get to the early 1600s, when it really broke the surface and people could hear about it externally, it'd been gestating for a while. The Rosicrucian tradition is really the modern appearance of this type of knowledge, and even the spiritual beings behind this particular group. Again, to cite something from Samuel Sagan of the Clear Vision School, he would say, what a spiritual tradition is a particular group of spiritual beings and human initiates working toward a common purpose. Now, this also leads toward understanding why in different spiritual traditions, there are some exercises that are universal, that you have to do, or you simply will not develop spiritually. Things like, and though we call different things, Gurdjieff may call it self-observation. The Buddhists may call it mindfulness. You know, it may have different names from different perspectives, but it's all about, first you have to start observing the contents of your thoughts. You have to start observing the contents of your speech, observing the contents of your feelings, observing the contents of your actions and of your will impulses in the world, these types of things. This is also connected to what we call the 6 essential exercises of the Rosicrucians. So no matter what your tradition is, you're going to have to do that stuff. You know, over the ancient temples in Greece and things, they said they would have like a saying of know thyself. Because if you don't know the content of what you're generating all the time with your thought, your speech, your actions, like the Buddhists talk about, then you're not going to make any progress. So that's essential. But then there are other types of practices that are done in particular traditions that are more particular to that tradition. And that's because within the different siddhas or powers developed in different traditions around the world, different traditions will be the guardians of certain types of knowledge. They will be the ones that really focus on developing certain things. So like one of the things the Rosicrucians really work on developing, and that they're at a leading edge of, is things like a ability to have spiritual discernment and to consciously understand the larger context of how all the different world traditions fit together into a unified system. And so that people can consciously understand it and navigate through it and make informed decisions about what am I going to do with my time and energy to develop spiritually and to create an optimal life. So the original Rosicrucian tradition was not going through any external person or any external authority structure for your spiritual connection. It was always about you learn to activate your own central column of energy and a central energetic structure. You don't see it represented as much in the West, but in things like Nepal, they have really clear representations of these energy structures. And of course, in parts of the Himalayan tradition. So in this central pillar of energy, this needs to be activated, and you need to be able to connect to non-physical beings, non-physical realities directly. So we cut out the middleman. You don't have to go through this other person. You don't have to go through this authority structure. At this point, that's become very toxic. At one time, it may have made sense, but today we just see more and more toxicity with how these things tend to play out when you give your spiritual power away to another person to make decisions for you. And so it's just part of the evolutionary process that we're in right now. So again, you asked me a fairly involved question, so I'm giving you a fairly involved answer here. So the Rosicrucian impulse that I feel a part of is something that is also why I'm interested in the work of the Essenes. I'm interested in the work of ancient Egypt, these types of things. Also interested, though, because the Rosicrucians understand all the systems, or that's the goal. I don't claim to understand all the systems perfectly, but I'm fascinated. I'm an enthusiast. I won't call myself an expert. I'm an enthusiast in pursuing this, to see how all these different things work and connect together, what we can learn from them. So there are certain pieces of wisdom that we can only find in some of the depths of Indian esotericism. There are certain things that we only find in Taoist internal alchemy from China. It's like, so there's these universal pieces, and there are these particular pieces where they hold precise pieces of knowledge related to their work, and then they'll give certain practices to their initiates to structure their subtle bodies so they become very advanced in whatever that piece of the puzzle is. So, we kind of have, like the old US TV show, the A-Team, all these different traditions are experts in their own field, and hopefully we'll all come together for the good to create the world we need to create. So, with that being the case, of course, people misunderstand things. They don't understand spiritual reality. They don't understand the whole context. So, over time, we began to develop Rosicrucian organizations that were not based on the original Rosicrucian impulse so much as they took on a type of Masonic hierarchical structure. So today there are multiple Rosicrucian organizations in the world that I'm not a part of. That's not my interest. If that's what people want to do, that's absolutely fine. I'm open to whatever's people's thing. I'm not too judgmental. But for me, I think it's important people at least understand that the original Rosicrucian impulse was about connecting directly to spirit, and any external teacher in the Rosicrucian tradition is a kind of elder brother or sister on the path. They're not an authority figure. They're not someone to have their word accepted without question. They're just someone who's sharing with you what they understand. But you're autonomous, and you connect directly to spirit, and you don't have to go through them or some external authority structure. And there's no grades to work through in that sense. You don't have to join any organization. You don't have to get this grade and that grade and pay money for that to get that next grade and have the politics of the organization. I want nothing to do with it personally. Now, I don't want to cause conflict with these Rosicrucian organizations. I'm sure that for their mindset and their approach, they may see it very differently. But I'm just telling you how I approach it and the way that I see it. So that's my take on what happened with Rosicrucianism. The original impulse is still there. The original beings behind these traditions that are still active are still there. So now cycling through the series of questions that you asked me, then getting to our understanding of the spiritual realities and the spiritual beings, we need to develop first an understanding, a contextual understanding, because there's no discernment without context. If you don't understand the different pieces of the puzzle, Rudolf Steiner, the great Rosicrucian initiate, once said that to understand anything in its totality, you have to see it from 12 different perspectives. It's like you're walking a circle around something, you see it from 12 different sides. Otherwise, it's like the blind man and the elephant. You only feel it from one side, that elephant's a wall. From another perspective, it's a rope, whatever it is. You got to see it from 12 perspectives, know what it really is. Now, that's why The zodiac is divided into 12 signs. There's 12 different perspectives on the sun in the middle. Or that around the Christ there were 12 disciples. You're not going to be able to understand a being of that level unless you have 12 different perspectives, the whole circle of perspectives around that being. So this is deeply embedded in the sacred geometry of both physical structures. I won't get into the actual sacred geometric forms right now, but there are certain sacred geometric forms that are based on this 12 around the one principle. And you see it then manifest in spiritual organizations and these things. So we need to understand the context for how this works. And the most fundamental sacred geometric pattern to understand beings that are more beneficial, more detrimental, and to be able to navigate our way through it is, and I'll just say very quickly that when I talk about this in terms of sacred geometry, the sacred geometry thought form, the archetypal pattern behind this thing, is actually a thought form from the mind of God. The thought forms from the mind of God is what create the pattern. It's actually how it started. Then it crystallizes down through the planes into all the different, what the Chinese call the 10,000 things, all the differentiated parts of the system. But at its core, it's threefold. And so the threefold part of the system is that there is one straight line connection between spirit and matter, that on things like the tree of life in the Jewish Kabbalah, which actually also existed in ancient Egypt before that, but that's a different discussion, that most people know it as the tree of life in the Jewish Kabbalah. They have that middle pillar, and the middle pillar on the tree of life is the only one that goes all the way up to the very top and all the way down to the very bottom. And this is that straight line connection between the macrocosm and the microcosm, between the higher spiritual realities and our reality crystallized here into the physical plane. And it is the path of the one right spiritual action at any time where things are perfectly balanced. Now, that's the balance point where spirit and matter are perfectly balanced. Yin and yang are perfectly balanced. All polarities. But then it can go off to either polarity. And so if it goes off to the spiritual polarity, then it's possible to fall prey to the spiritual trial that we all have to overcome, which is the trial of ego inflation. We think we're way more developed than we actually are. We become the little guru and we're like espousing all types of things, and we get some followers and we place ourselves above them, and we just create all of these fantasies about how incredibly advanced we are. So that's one part of that. And that leads to a type of illusory spirituality. And so the spiritual beings that are connected to this, that have had some level of ego inflation themselves, and they have a perspective on humanity that is such that their influence on us is that they kind of get us toward, number one, illusory forms of spirituality, things that we might like to be true that aren't true, but also to overestimate our state of spiritual development, which almost always leads to a crash and a fall later on. So these beings were known for their extremely bright light, because as we said before, like with the astral plane, once we move into higher consciousness levels, that's reflected in light. In fact, light and consciousness are the exact same thing. So if you experience consciousness externally, you perceive it as light. That's like the light around the heads or the bodies of the initiates. And if you experience light internally, it's consciousness. And so it's the exact same thing, only experienced inside or outside. And so they understood these beings to be beings of great, brilliant light. They are more advanced than humanity, sometimes called the great old ones. They're older than we are. They've been evolving longer. They've evolved, but they took a kind of a weird tangent. They don't always intend a lot of harm, but because they don't understand what we in our world here and our alchemical process is about, that we have to balance spirit and matter in a particular way, they just tell us, oh, the earth's an illusion. You can get off the cycle of karma and reincarnation and just kind of get off the planet and not have to deal with all this, etc. They think they're doing us a favor by telling us this. And they are beings of great spiritual wisdom. Once you get past some of that stuff, they do know quite a lot of things. They're more evolved than we are. But these beings were then known as beings of great light. But it's a kind of light that can be so bright that it blinds. and it's not necessarily something that illuminates accurately. And so with the ancient languages, this became the leader of this being referred to then as the light bearer, or Lucifer. Luciferic beings are beings of great light, great spiritual knowledge and wisdom, but there's often a knuckleball in that wisdom where it's skewed, or there's illusions in it, or things that pump up your ego and have nothing to do with your real spiritual purpose and task in this earth plane, these kinds of things. So that's one side. The other side it can go off is toward materiality, to a type of radical materialism. And that's very common today. So these beings, the radical materialism beings, weren't as strong in ancient times. Thousands of years ago, people's primary influence as far as these beings to one polarity or the other, much stronger toward the Luciferic beings. Now, we're getting really pulled, although Lucifer is still very strong, particularly in spiritual circles, we're getting very pulled toward the materialistic beings. And so these beings were really, from what I can find in historical documents, they were first really seen and described in the Persian Zoroastrian system, and where this particular group of beings, or the leader of this group of beings that lead toward materiality and a loss of any perception of spiritual reality, these beings were referred to in the Zoroastrian system as Angermenu or as Ahriman. And so this then became the archetype of like the dark lord of this world. So the Aramonic figure is seen in Zoroastrianism as opposed to the beneficial being of the sun, Ahura Mazda, which is absolutely connected to the solar deity in the Vedic tradition, in the Egyptian tradition, etc. And so Ahura Mazda, the spiritual being seen in the sphere of the sun, is opposed by this more materialistic being. And for a while, people couldn't even really perceive this being. And in the Zoroastrian tradition, they first began to describe it, and then it took a historical trajectory from there. So these beings, they know that spiritual reality is real. They are spiritual beings, but they have a particular ability and a particular task. They fell in love with crystallization. They fell in love with matter in a way that became very one-sided in the whole cosmic process. And so when the higher spiritual beings, following the thought forms of the Godhead, began to create the sacred geometric blueprints of everything that manifests in our world, these beings are a part of the process to actually crystallize it into physical matter. It's their siddha. It's a real power that they have. But they fell in love with this. And they also have a desire to physically incarnate themselves, but they're not allowed to, because that would be like allowing a child molester to be playing in the sandbox with the little children.
Is this where the 4 watchtowers exist?
That's right. That gets into the deeper teachings about the establishment of the 4 watchtowers with particular beneficial spiritual beings. So these beings, the one-sided materialistic beings, their influence on us has become much stronger in modern times as part of our evolutionary process, where we've become more materialistic and individuated and logical linear with no spiritual perception ourselves. So we're easy prey to these beings saying, oh yeah, all that spiritual stuff is fantasy. Now, the way that they work is first to make you believe that anything spiritual, non-physical, doesn't exist. There is nothing but physical reality. That's become a dogma in modern science, in modern medicine, in the West. That's affected the whole world. But if you have the ability to say, well, no, I know that there's something more than this. I know that there's like a higher reality than just the physical plane. They do these things that were beautifully described by C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters. They'll change their tactic. And they say, oh, yes, you're smart. You're one of the ones that's smart enough to figure it out. And then they'll give you these representations of spiritual reality that are corrupted by materialistic thought forms. This is something that's almost completely not understood at all in modern spirituality, to our great detriment. Many of our spiritual concepts that we find today on the marketplace are affected by what the Rosicrucians call occult materialism. So it's like the true reality is physical matter, and then they put a little icing on the cake, a little superstructure on top of it that's a reflection of physical reality. rather than understanding this is just a crystallization of all those higher levels, which are the true causal levels. This is not the causal level. This is the effect level. They've reversed that. And then they have endless mischief getting us confused about real spiritual reality because they just give us these materialistic corruptions of what spiritual development is about and spiritual realities. So that's these particular beings. Again, they were called Araman or Angrimenu in the old Zoroastrian time. And then as we got into the Egyptian tradition, this being, this impulse, was referred to as Set. Then, as Moses was initiated in the Egyptian temples and then led the Jews out and created the Jewish Kabbalah out of what he had learned in the Egyptian, but then changed it into this new religious system. Set became then in the Hebrew language Ha-Satan, meaning the adversary. So Ha-Satan then became simplified to Satan. And so that's the Satan that we have in Western metaphysics today. The problem is that with the loss of any understanding of spiritual reality, it began to be that references to Lucifer versus Satan were misunderstood as it's all the same being. And it doesn't even make any sense. Once you think that, you cannot have any discernment of real spiritual beings. These beings are completely polar opposite in how they affect us and in what their structure is and all of those things. So we have to understand that they're very different. Even their agendas are different. And the way they affect us is very different. Once I found that when I clarify this for people, and it's not just me, this is like a fundamental thing in Rosicrucianism as well. And even some parts of other traditions, like there are some Jesuits that will talk about, oh yeah, Satan and Lucifer are not the same being. But you don't get that from the mainstream Catholic Church stuff. As like an initiate in that tradition, I was like, oh yeah, they're different. But to know that they're different is very, very important. So one of the things we become aware of as we're developing spiritually and we start perceiving non-physical realities is that there's all types of different phenomena. There can be all types of lower level beings than these. These are like at a high level. There's all types of more elemental beings that may have become corrupted and operate in a dysfunctional way. And that leads to various methods and traditions of being able to pull these detrimental entities out of the human energy system where they feed on certain things and that type of thing. But again, it's easy for this to become sensationalized and fear-based. And it's no different to remove one of these entities from the human energy field than it would be to go to remove a splinter at a urgent care. But, everything gets sensationalized and dramatized and it goes off the rails. And that supports certain detrimental beings. They like it being sensationalized. They like the fear. They feed on the fear. So the first thing we need to do is just kind of get a rational perspective on the whole thing and understand that we're going to keep our focus on the beneficial beings. We're all influenced by the Luciferic and Aramonic impulses, but we don't have to react to it. It's just a part of the way that the world is. It would be like overreacting to the fact like everywhere I go in the earth is not perfectly balanced in warmth. Some places are super hot and some places are super cold, and I'm going to freak out anytime I go somewhere hot or cold. That's the same thing if we're being affected by these beings. That's like a part of the natural process. So anyway, I know that was a long-winded answer, but it was an in-depth question, so I wanted to unfold it a little bit.
No, thank you so much for, I feel like the question has really been honored in your response. Thank you for taking the time and feel free to share as long as you wish. I can listen to you forever.
Thank you.
Unpack these concepts. There was a takeaway for me as well that, pardon the pun, I'm a dad now, so I think I'm hilarious. But we shouldn't demonize these forces because they're also there to sort of support us on our path. But actually, you said context is important for discernment, and with the Rosicrucianism, like it's important to actually develop that discernment to a certain level, right?
Absolutely. So this is one of the things most lacking today in the independent path to spiritual development that I often talk about, because a lot of people are voting with their feet to have an independent path to spiritual development to where I'm not just going to learn from this one guru or from this one tradition. I'm going to open myself up to learn and understand things from any direction that has truth, and to put it together into a system that will work for them and whatever their particular purpose is. So I always emphasize with people, my work with Vesica is to clarify context for you. And what I always hear from people when I teach these things, which I do in a completely non-authoritarian context, it's not some type of charismatic transmission that you have to accept. It's just like, don't accept any of it until it makes sense to you. It'll become so obvious it couldn't be any other way. Until then, it doesn't really have any value. But to understand that what I'm giving are things that are meant to save you time on the path, because life's a limited time opportunity. You got a very finite timeline here to do what you came here to do. And this is connected to another part of what we're doing with Vesica. When I say it's about helping people remember, who am I, why am I here, what did I come to do? The reality that I see, which is related to what the Russian philosopher Gurdjieff called the terror of the situation, is that the majority of people are not fulfilling their karmic contract. They are not doing what they agreed to do before incarnation, when they had a much expanded consciousness on the whole thing. We get so lost and confused and traumatized by what we go through on the physical plane, just trying to overcome the draft of forgetfulness and find a way in this world with very little reflection of who we really are, that it's very easy to get lost. And so it's become the case that the majority of people that I see are not doing what they came here to do. Now, part of that is working on themselves, but the other part is like an act of service to the world. And it's different for different people. What one person's task is not the same as my task. I've been working on my task for many, many, many lifetimes. It's a very particular trajectory. And I love doing it. It's something that I love. It's not like a burden. It's exciting. But that's like my thing. Yours may be something completely different. But we all need to have that contextual information to help remember, who am I, why am I here, etc. So that's a major part of what we're approaching right now, is to give people that contextual understanding.
So I think at this point, understanding the energetic body that we develop is an important point in this conversation to highlight that. And I think also just to sort of again honor the word context that you gifted us so deeply in the previous response to the previous question. Yeah, it's interesting because we can also get enamored by building our structure, our energetic structure, and yet I'm also seeing that as like the whole science of Ayurveda, not that this is Ayurveda, but the whole science of Ayurveda exists actually to facilitate your dharma at the heart of it, right? And so like health exists to facilitate purpose. And so there's this dance between building your own energetic structure and also what you're here to do in this lifetime. So, you know, there's two parts to that. Yes, we're obviously misguided, swayed, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of forces at play. But then the invitation to really build this energetic structure, but then not to get overly obsessed with it as well, because you are also here to do something in the world as well. Can you help me clarify my way through all that and how to actually do that?
Right. So I appreciate you're talking about Ayurveda and about, you know, we are attaining health for a particular purpose. Now, if we take that into what we see in modern independent path of spiritual development around the world, we have another challenge that's very common today, and that is a misunderstanding of the preliminary step to doing real spiritual structuring and development work. Because the preliminary step always has to be healing, is to get healthy. So the root of the word healing in the West is whole. It's to make us whole. And so the essence of this is that until we become coherent enough, until we deal with enough of our trauma that we've processed it to the point that we are coherent enough that we can actually do inner work, then we have to focus on healing. And of course, for some people, this is a harder task than others because they've had more trauma. They've had very difficult lives. But what we have to be very careful about is that we don't get stuck in that. And so I often find that when people talk about healing in metaphysical circles, They don't have any concept of anything beyond that. It's like, oh, well, it's endless. I'll be healing forever. Well, yes, there's always more layers of the onion, and we can heal more things and get more whole, and we can get more coherent, but we can't wait forever to start doing the actual work. Healing is not the actual work. Healing is the preliminary to the work. And this is horribly misunderstood today. Now, I'm in no way trying to diminish the significance of real core healing work. It's absolutely essential. And God bless everybody who's undertaken that in their own path and people who provide healing work to others as an act of service. It's absolutely essential. You can't do anything without it. The problem is when we don't have any vision that it's only a preliminary step to start doing the actual work, the actual development. And so the simplified format for it that I often tell people is that, yes, do the healing work, and you can keep doing it in the background, but you're doing the healing work to get you to the point that you are coherent enough to be able to do the next level, the first real level of the work, what you came here to do, and that is activation. Now, when you start getting into the deeper levels of the different types of Indian yoga and into the Chinese Taoist internal alchemy and things like this, there's all types of practices to activate your energy systems. So they'll have it in a slightly different context. There may be a focus on activating chakras in India. There may be activating certain meridians and acupuncture points in the Taoist system, these kinds of things. But the essence of it is that our whole energy system is in somewhat of a slumbering state until we activate it with consciousness and energy. At that point, we develop new organs of spiritual perception. Every chakra is an organ of spiritual perception. Every organ in the body is an organ of spiritual perception. And so that's well described in Ayurveda and Chinese Taoist work particularly. They're really strong on that. They really make it really clear how that works. And so we have to not get stuck in healing, although again, very, very important to do it, to get whole and coherent. But then we have to start activating. So what are the practices that we do to activate our consciousness? What are the practices that we do to activate our energy? Limited time opportunity, and we only got so much time and energy every day to do something, so we got to make informed decisions about what practices am I going to do that are the most important. That's why I introduced a certain set of practices in my online course called Essential Teachings and Practices of Spiritual Science, things that are really universals. Now, I may teach them from the perspective of a certain tradition. So, for example, I talk about the 6 essential exercises of the Rosicrucians. But you'll find that those 6 essential exercises within a particular concise context that makes sense to people in modern times, you'll find analogs to that in every great tradition. You'll find them in India, you'll find them in China, you'll find them in Egypt, you'll find them everywhere. So there's a certain set of these things that we need to know to start structuring our subtle body, to start activating these things. But lots of times people will get activations, but they can't hold it. So that means the next level after the activation has got to be stabilization. Now, this is also very clearly described in things like Taoist internal alchemy in China, which is an amazing advanced system, that you can't just activate, it has to be activated and stabilized so that you can maintain it. And there's brilliant observations like in the Indian tradition about this, that this works cyclically. And so, for example, it's understood in the Indian tradition that when you wake up in the morning, you're in a dense, heavy, tamasic state. And that tamas is something that, you're not at a very elevated state at that point. You're kind of heavy and weighed down, very physicalized. But then you got to summon your energy. You got to get the energy revved up, which, if you do it through what the Buddhists would call unskillful means you take in caffeine or sugar or something to try to rev up your system, but in the long term doesn't work out well. Or through more skillful means, you would do some type of yogic practice, and you do pranayama to get energy flowing in the body, and you would do postures to open up the channels and all these types of things. But you then need to use the rajas to get the energy flowing and get you out of that tamasic, heavy, dense state. And then you can get enough of the boost energy going that you can reach sattva. And once you reach the sattvic state, now your airplane's at cruising altitude. It was on the ground, you revved it up to the point that you got high enough that now you can just cruise at that level. But even that has a duration to it, because we're still in a physical body. And no matter how activated your sattvic state is, at some point, you're going to get hungry, you're going to get thirsty, you're going to get tired, and you're going to fall back into tamas. And it's a cycle. And you just have to understand that's the way the cycle works. Some people want to be activated all the time in this type of rajas state, and so they can reach sattva, but you have to rest, you have to go to this other thing. So when we activate, can we maintain that activation, meaning keeping the activated parts of our energy system, keeping those structures stable that we've activated, even though we have to go through rest stages and such. It's not just like you lose it. You are holding it in place while you rest and recharge, and then keep taking it up to higher and higher levels. So these are some fundamental concepts that we need for really understanding, not getting stuck in just healing. You have to activate. That's where the work is really beginning. Then you have to stabilize it. This is something I often talk about with people today, that I've become quite active in the psychedelic Renaissance community, which really started with my being invited by the Oxford Psychedelic Society to talk to them about the spiritual aspects of what's going on with people doing all these powerful plant medicines, which I am not in any way opposed to, but it needs to be understood in a different context, because you'll often find people talking about, oh, I did too much of this and now I've got some issue coming from it, or I had this great opening, but now I'm just living in hell again. And just because of not understanding about activation, stabilization, and understanding this as part of a spiritual process, as stages of an alchemical process. That needs to come back into the psychedelic Renaissance. And I find that when people have that frame of reference, it becomes way more functional for them. Because that's how it was in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the use of these medicines were within a very clear alchemical step-by-step developmental process. So even once we reach the point of stabilization, we're still only at the point that we're kind of getting ourselves ready to do something, and that becomes then the application stage. Now you can do what you came here to do. Let's go do it. And get out of this problem right now where everybody is so caught up with their own suffering and confusion and acting out that they're not doing their karmic contract. So I think those are a few basic ideas that are helpful for understanding the context we're working in today.
Yeah, and so you touched on the 6 Rosicrucian, well, are they basic? Are they the fundamental exercises? But I know they're sort of also coded in this 12 petal lotus at the heart that you refer to as well. And then 6 of them we've addressed prior to coming into this incarnation, and 6 we have the opportunity to work with in this incarnation. Yeah, maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us to understand what the work looks like.
Absolutely. So there are particular...
And also, sorry, just the different... Because the Rosicrucians come from the heart as a system to work outwards, but then there are also other systems that work top down, bottom up. Sorry.
Yes. No, that's helpful. So this is something I go into more detail on in the introductory spiritual science course, Essential Teachings and Practices of Spiritual Science. I talk about the way that we need to understand that if you're looking at comparative activation, initiation practices from different traditions, you have to understand some fundamentals. Without that, you can't really make sense of what's going on. One of those fundamentals you just referred to, and again, I describe this in more detail in the course, but the basic idea is that there are certain ways of activating the human energy system that's from bottom up. And so that would be like some of the Kundalini systems in the Himalayan system. So you're activating the base chakra first, then you activate the sex chakra, and then you keep moving up the ladder until you activate the crown and go up the column. Now, the challenge for the bottom-up method is that this led to the development of an ashram system where they would try to keep people from excessive sexual temptation. Because if you're opening up the base chakra first and then the sex chakra, you're going to have a lot of energy in the sex chakra. Now, I'm in no way a sex-negative person. I think people should explore and embody this as best they can, make hay while the sun is shining. But it's just like this was the understanding in the Indian tradition. It's like, well, we want people to still keep moving up the ladder and not stop there. So we'll put them in an ashram. We'll tell them to have certain visualizations of members of the opposite sex that may lead to them not having as much sexual desire, these kinds of things. And So there's the bottom-up method. And we could say in some ways this is actually an energy-first method. So for energy and consciousness, bottom-up would be energy first. You're opening up, big energy centers. This is like the core energy. And then you have lots of energy to work on the consciousness centers higher up.
Shakti. Yeah.
And again, I'm not putting down any of these methods. I'm just describing the context for them. People have been able to attain enlightenment using all these different systems I'm about to describe. They're just different approaches. Then you have the top-down system. Top-down system is more like the modern Western system. And it was shown in the Christian tradition by showing the column of energy above the head of Jesus when he was baptized in the Jordan by John. And they show the dove of the Holy Spirit coming down the column and entering into the crown center. And so that is actually showing the activation of the crown center first with the powerful spiritual energies that are above the head. And so you activate the crown first, then the centers in the forehead, like the one up here, that's where the uraeus comes out in ancient Egypt, then the one here around the third eye, and then you work down to the later ones. Again, advantages and disadvantages of it. This way you have a lot of coherent awareness and able to have discernment and guide things as you go because you're opening up these higher awareness centers first. But again, this is something that if it doesn't go far enough, then it can lead to a person becoming just very intellectual and not transforming and connecting to the earth, to their body, to their sexuality, to all the life force energy, which is the exact opposite of the challenge that you have coming in the bottom-up system. Now, they're both workable systems, but that's kind of how it developed over time. There's a bottom-up system and there's a top-down system. Now, the Rosicrucians approach this differently. And so, if you understand it from a sacred geometry perspective, the center is always the thing. The center is the key thing. And the center can be expressed in different ways. So when we talked about the central pillar with what in the West would be Christic, Michaelic. In Buddhism, it would be the Buddhic, etc. That central pillar of the beneficial energies, everything's balanced, spirit and matter, and it can go off balance to these different directions. Then we have the whole issue that as we are developing our consciousness, that we have two different poles here with consciousness first or energy first. Well, the Rosicrucians want to go straight to the center, that middle pillar. And so the center of this, like if you look at the image of 7 chakras from the Himalayan tradition, what's in the center is the heart center. And in all types of energetic work and spiritual work, and this includes the incredible Egyptian biogeometry work that I'm fortunate to teach from the work of my teacher in Egypt, Dr. Ibrahim Karim, everything is about the center. How do you activate the energy of the center? And so in the Rosicrucian system, rather than going top down or bottom up, we go center out. And so when we have the 6 essential exercises of the Rosicrucians, which is, and just to give people a very short overview, it's a lot more detail, and I take you through the steps step by step in the course, is that first it is to observe and direct the thinking, then to observe and direct your feeling forces, the emotional body particularly, and then to observe and direct your will impulses and the actions you're taking in the world. Again, these are universals. You'll find some form of this in every great tradition. You can't do anything without it. These are essentials. Then the next one is that you have to develop a very beneficial perspective. You have to have a tremendous positivity toward everything that comes. And easier said than done, particularly in an age that tends toward negativity and over-criticism of things, but to have a positive view of things, even challenges in life. And then the next aspect is to have a type of radical openness to new perspectives and new ways of seeing things and new ways of being, new ways of living. If you're going to grow into a bigger being, you better have some openness to breaking a lot of the crust that you currently live in. Even if the people around you are like, what are you doing? You're going to have to evolve into some higher states. So a type of radical openness to seeing things differently, living differently. And then
judgment.
Yes. But discernment, but without superficial judgment. Yes, that's the key. And then the 6th part is to be able to harmonize all these together. It's like a stabilization. Harmonize all of it as not something they ought to put time aside in a day to like do this exercise, do that exercise, but you've done the exercises enough that you've integrated it and you're doing it in the background all the time. You're conscious at this level and you're functioning at that level all the time. You have the positivity, you have the openness, you have the observation and beneficial direction of the thinking, feeling, and willing, and all becomes part of an integrated system. Now, the reason this is connected to the heart is it's quite literally connected to the heart, to the center of our energy system. And one way that the Rosicrucians look at this is that we don't have an organizing center for our energy body until we do these practices. Until you activate your heart center, there is no organizing center for your body of energy. Just a bunch of crazy stuff going off in all kind of different directions. You always have to have an organizing center for anything.
Okay, guys, quickly jumping in here to ask you a question. Leave me a comment in the comments below. Which of these Rosicrucian exercises are you most enamored by? Will you be integrating into your being? And how is your relationship with your subtle, energetic body and structuring it? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below about your relationship with this stuff. Back to today's episode.
So this creates the organizing center because the heart, as understood in the great Vedic tradition, is a 12-petal lotus. And the 12-petal lotus, every lotus petal has a different power, a different siddha. And so the 6 of them, as you mentioned, were developed in previous times. And what we need to do now is develop the other 6. If we develop the other 6, then all 12 lotus petals will be activated. The vortex movement will become more powerful. The organizing center will become fully activated. And everything else we do in our consciousness and energy throughout the energy system will be coherently structured and now has an organizing center. And so to develop those 6 other lotus petals, of course, that's the 6 essential exercises in Rosicrucianism. Every one of those lotus petals is connected to a particular siddha, power, activity, a particular exercise. That's why they're called the 6 essential exercises. If we actually work on the 6 essential exercises, it'll activate the organizing center in the body of energy, activate the heart chakra. That becomes a solid foundation for all of the other more advanced work we do later. And solid foundations are essential for our structuring of the subtle body. If you don't have a solid foundation, you can go through all types of massive activations, like when people do huge amounts of psychotropics, but they don't have a foundation for it to land on. It's not necessarily going to give them the result they're hoping for.
And discussing the result we're hoping for, building this, I'm almost seeing it, maybe this is the engineer in me, but as a capacitator, something to like build that capacity that it can actually, like a container that can actually support you, and something you can build. And it's really interesting, as you mentioned earlier, the sheath, the opportunity, and you've mentioned this a few times in the podcast, just this limited time opportunity, just the development of this particular capacity, this container. The question being the importance of it, and the dance of karma that we carry between lifetime to lifetime. Because I think we being Indian by nature, like karma is something we discuss. Like, you're raised in the in the soup of, well, why did that happen to such and such? Oh, well, that was his karma. I feel like I'm having conversations with karma like some people that are coming to it later, but obviously we're all on our own path. But then realizing that actually this is actually supporting us lifetime to lifetime, and the importance of that. And then if you can just highlight the how that actually happens, like the importance of this work, because then also, something about the way you highlight. I didn't realize that the Egyptian Book of the Dead was called the Coming into the Light. I like that. That is profound.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a number of things there. Let me start with talking a little bit about understanding that our lifetime is a sacred geometry in time, from birth to death, just like there's a sacred geometry of space. There's patterns in time, just like there's patterns in space. So in the great Vedic tradition, the science of Jyotish, the science of light, which in the West we tend to call Vedic astrology, is really the sacred geometry of time. And it's a very advanced, amazing system. And I found it to be of incredible value and help. So one thing about then understanding Jyotish that is not clearly brought out in Western astrology, and there are certain systems within Jyotish that don't exist in Western astrology, like the time cycles of the planetary forces, the dasha system. You just don't have that in the West, and it's like super important. But the whole idea here is that it's understood in Jyotish that your karmas will ripen at a particular moment in time, and the moments that they will ripen are predetermined. What you do with them is up to you. How you deal with that karma ripening is up to you, because it may lead to things that are more Saturn in nature, which nobody likes and are very hard. It's a very hard teacher, but sometimes lead to your greatest growth in life. Or it could be something that's more Jupiterian, and it's like, this is great. Everything's just flowing and expanding, and I'm having a great time. But it can take these different forms. And so with the Jyotish, it's very helpful because what it does is it shows you the moments that your karmas will ripen. So that's how the natal chart, your birth chart, is understood. It is a time map for when your karmas will ripen, with a structure of your consciousness and energy being shown in the natal chart. And then if you look at the progressed transit places of the planets, etc., those are going to activate some of the natal positions, the time that you were born, where things were. When you have a particular angle and particular geometric position of a planet moving in the heavens to that one, it's going to trigger a karma. And so unbelievable depth of knowledge in Jyotish about what karma will be triggered by what of these cosmic clock activations. So whether a person gets into Jyotish or not, and I found it very valuable to have Jyotish readings from very advanced practitioners, so I know what's coming down the pike. You know, there's a saying that I'm going to butcher from the original Sanskrit that's like, to be aware of and to avoid the challenge or danger that has not yet come. That's what we're going to be doing when we understand the time progression, and we can brace ourselves for some of the more difficult things and take it on more consciously. So we have all kinds of karmas we've generated in the past, and they will really, there are times in our lives we don't have to deal with that karma too much, but other times it's going to come right up in our face, and we're going to have to deal with this. And so it's very important to, when things come up, again, it's helpful to have foreknowledge, but if you don't, then just when it happens out of the blue, you need to take it on and to deal with it in a positive way. So we need to have a sense of the things that come to us as unpleasant challenges are, like the Chinese say, you know, crises are dangerous opportunities. And so they're an opportunity for us to work through something. And so when you study a person's energetic structure and we start talking about structuring the subtle bodies, everything that we do on a regular basis with the thoughts we generate, with the feelings we generate, and the actions we take. Now, that takes us back to the 6 essential exercises. We're examining those. But behind the scenes, all the time, we're generating certain types of thought forms. Some of these are thought forms that create illness and distress and bad karma. Same thing for some of our feelings. Same things for some of our will impulses, the actions we take in the world, where we could have helped somebody, but we were too narcissistic to bother. Or we get upset and we act out and we harm somebody in a way that was not right. Those things are a cause set in motion.
Hey, your Inspired Tribe. I want to take a quick sec. I wanted to share something today with you that is really dear to my heart, and it's actually what keeps the entire ecosystem around the Inspired Evolution thriving, my one-on-one coaching. So it's basically coaching that helps you live a spiritually aligned life. I coach people from all different types of walks of life. These people are leaders and they're looking to have an incredible spiritual impact in the lives that they're leading for themselves, and then also lead in alignment to their values. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a few people that have also transformed through my coaching, and here's what they have to say.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines. And
he's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing.
Then my corporate banking job wasn't really doing it.
You feel like you're not making progress towards your goals.
And Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
I'm more in control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
As you guys can see, there's a lot of people all over the world from all these different corners experiencing incredible transformations. I don't think, if I can say humbly myself, that there is anything quite like this somewhere else online. Most people that, have channels that, grow and grow and grow don't really focus on one-to-one offerings. I have just found that it is the most profound space where you can bring yourself in a private container and really just share what's going on for yourself. And if you want to book in for that call with me, touch base, it's www.amrit.coach/life. That's www.amrit.coach/LIFE. There is a link in the show notes below to book in that call. And yeah, if you want to take your journey further, if you want to dive in deeper, and you really want to live a spiritually aligned life, if it's for you, please do check it out. And without too much further ado, once again, for your spirit, for yourself, today's podcast.
And so when we begin to understand that we're constantly generating karma with what we think and we feel and we act, then we realize that we need to, through the practices like I just described, 6 essential exercises, start cleaning that up. Because what you send out, you're going to get back. That's always the case. So we can go into the practices and start working with that and start cleaning it up and correcting it. And we can also take the most painful challenges that we have in life, which sometimes are development of new karma. It could be somebody else acting out detrimentally. We didn't choose it, but they acted out detrimentally and it affected us, and now we've started a new karma with them. Or it could be something that we've done in the past detrimentally that's now needs to play out. I'm going to have that reflected back to me, and it's like, well, how do you like it when it happens to you after you did it to somebody else? That's a classic karma thing. But to take that on and to let it deepen us, and to understand that this is something that in the end will be very beneficial, because all suffering is finite, but the gifts it gives us is going to be infinite. That's like the lesson we have to take from it. The suffering is finite. The gifts we get from what we learn from it can be infinite. It's kind of like the beautiful statement in the book The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, where he talks about the way that our suffering is hollowing us out with sharp knives to create a space inside of us that can be filled with joy later. We have to make a space for that joy that's going to come later to fill us. That's very much how I look at it. So there would just be some beginning considerations I have about encountering our karma and our structuring the subtle bodies, the importance of the practices that we do, the importance of seeing this as a karmic opportunity in the time sequence of our life to move ourselves up to a higher level, overcome that challenge. Because until we get to the point that the challenge is no longer difficult for us, it will continue to repeat in lifetime after lifetime. If you get to where, well, that's just like another day, and you know how to handle it, and it's not a big deal, at that point it can dissipate. It can absolutely disappear. There's also a fascinating idea, before I drop this topic, in the Vedic system, where they talk about astral remedies. And so you'll find certain things in your Jyotish chart with the ripening of karmas, and they'll have different ways of approaching particular challenges. Like if you got a particular transit of Saturn, that's going to activate this particular karma that you will not find very pleasant and you'll need to deal with. There are certain types of astral remedies. Some of it is working at the vibrational level, like what we call vibrational science at the Vesica Institute, which is certain types of stones, or in Ayurveda, certain types of herbs. They will carry a vibrational essence that can help us in dealing with whatever that challenge is. Or it could be some certain types of folk practices, throw black sesame seeds in the river at this particular time, whatever that is. But the key of that really is that the key astral remedy is to do the practices that are going to change your conscious awareness so that you've cleaned up whatever was the thing that generated the detrimental karma, so that you no longer generate detrimental karma from the thought, speech, feelings, action, but also so that you then compensate for the harm you did in the past through beneficial activities now. That's our acts of service. There's a beautiful saying that's a reflection of this in the Western Holy Grail tradition, which is that the Grail grants in advance the life claimed in its service. Now, what that means is that according to a strict law of karma, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which, as Gandhi said, makes the whole world blind, that to get out of that type of Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, into the New Testament in the Western tradition of forgiveness and being able to move past it and stop that karmic knot, just evaporate that and go on. There's a really important aspect of this where we have certain things we've done in the past. We may have harmed people, we may have killed people. It may have been in a wartime and we were protecting our own people in that wartime, but nonetheless you killed somebody and you still carry the karma of that. And so if the strict karma of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth had to be worked out, then let's say you were in a wartime, you killed 20 people. And you weren't a raving maniac, it was just part of being a soldier at that time, whatever it is. Well, according to the hard law of karma, you would have to be killed by each of those 20 people in other lifetimes, which becomes just an endless misery of one horrific life after another. How do we get out of that karmic knot? That's what the New Testament is about, following the Old Testament in the Western system. And so it's not only about forgiveness, forgive others their trespasses as we'd like to be forgiven for ours, that sort of thing. But it's also this thing about acts of service. And so when we make sure that we have a balance in our life of not only the things we're getting that we want for us, but also the acts of service that we're near giving out, that actually becomes serving the Grail in the Western system. So the Grail grants in advance the life claimed in his service means I don't have to be killed by those 20 people in 20 different lifetimes. I can provide help to them. Maybe I become a medical doctor and I help them survive a medical challenge that would have killed them otherwise. I took their life at one time, now I've given them their life. That would be an example of this. So by acts of service, we can overcome the horror of endless, hard form of karma, get into the forgiveness impulse, which in the Western system comes from the sun, comes from the solar logos, it comes from the Christos. This is a solar yoga that we perform. And so this becomes a part of how we work with karma beneficially.
I love that. I feel like there's so much yet to be asked about where we're all going from here. And some people do go on and some people choose to come back as bodhisattvas. I'm conscious of the time we have left. Is that a question we can get answered in this short amount of time? That's
actually a great question to end on here, because we are coming to the end of our time. So what you're referring to there, just so everybody's on the same page with us, is that when we pass at the end of an incarnation, there is a choice that we make during that movement through the spiritual world before we come back into the next incarnation, which is that we need to make a choice about, do I just go out into the universe or do I come back to earthly incarnation? And in our lower state consciousness, we often feel like, I don't want to come back, it's painful here. And that can be quite true. That's why the Buddhists talk about, life is suffering, but they don't mean like, oh, life is suffering. What they mean is, life is suffering, get over it, embrace the possibilities of this, and just take that for granted and go do what you're going to do as best as you can and make the best of all of it. So there's an aspect of this that in the Buddhist system, one might take the Bodhisattva vow, which means that even though you've developed far enough that you could just go off into the cosmos and have your fun adventures in whatever plane you choose to operate on, you choose to come back, which will necessarily entail suffering. You're accepting that up front. You choose to come back until all sentient beings attain enlightenment. And so that's like a high spiritual attainment that one would choose to do that. And it's one of those things that's easy to say and hard to do once you get down into the weeds of a hard incarnation. But I mean, that's the beautiful part of this high-level initiate sort of thing. Because for a high-level initiate, even if it entails suffering, even being tortured and killed by the authorities of the time, it's something that for a true initiate, there's only one right action at the time, and they will do that one right action regardless of the consequence, regardless of the level of suffering that will entail. Now, one thing we have to say about this is something that's absolutely beautiful, the Bodhisattva vow. And the earth will likely have very difficult times coming up. If we see what's happening now in modern technology as a seed, and we see the way that seeds ripen into plants, when some of the seeds being planted right now in modern technology ripen in coming times, which we may have to deal with in our next incarnations, if we're not active enough now to try to push it into the right direction, if it goes toxic, it's going to be rough. But knowing that these things are coming, choosing to continue to come back and help other people, even though we've reached the point we don't have to come back for our own development, is something that we should hold as something that we hold in very high esteem. And for any person that attains that level, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now, let me now give a caution. Part of ego inflation that I talked about before is one of the first challenges that every person will find on the spiritual path, and that is so toxic today in metaphysical circles with so much ego inflation. People think they're so much more advanced than they are. And I'm just not saying it's like, oh, that's those other people, that's not me. It's all of us. We all have that particular challenge. It's something that we need to be very aware that the majority of human beings are not developed to the point that they are ready to stop the cycle of Earth incarnations and go out into the cosmos. You're not ready to do that until you have perfect equanimity about coming back or not. Because only then have you reached the point that any of the challenges you could have on Earth are things, yeah, another day at the office. I could do it a whole bunch more times, but I don't really need to because I kind of got it down at this point. Until you've reached that level of equanimity about it, because lots of times people say, oh, I'm not going to come back. I'm too advanced. I don't need to come back. If you look behind the surface, it's really a part of them that I don't want to suffer anymore. I don't want to deal with this. And the Luciferic beings play it up like, oh yeah, you're so advanced, you don't need to come back. But actually, it often has a deep emotional root of, I don't want to come back and deal with this shit anymore. I don't want this level of suffering. We have to be aware that, again, unless you've reached that level, that any possible challenge on physical incarnation is something that is like nothing to you, then you need to keep coming back. Because that's the reason this world exists. It's to like put you through this development process, to structure you through going through all these experiences. So we need to be very, very cautious about that. People misestimating their real level of spiritual development and thinking, oh yeah, I can just leave, I can go. So they may choose to do so, but that's going to be a mistake. And the Luciferic beings are going to absolutely tell you, yeah, you don't need to come back. But that will often, if you actually examine the consequences, doesn't work out well because they haven't fully developed their organs of spiritual perception. Not only have they not developed their core independent self in all the facets to be a beautiful jewel for the cosmos later on, all kind of facets are not fully developed. There's also the aspect that they didn't spend enough time here to do the practices, structure the subtle body, so that they've developed all their organs of spiritual perception. So now when they're reborn into spirit, they don't have full visual clairvoyance. They don't have full auditory clairaudience. You know, there's all of these higher aspects they would need to be fully present rather than crippled in the greater spiritual world that they have not developed far enough. And this becomes a horrible trick for some people. It's just their emotional body says, I want to get out of here. But no, that will not work out for you. So again, these are things that contextually are just not well understood today about why we would choose to come back, even though this can be painful and unpleasant at times. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up related to this topic. Yes, for a true Bodhisattva to come back is a huge sacrifice. God bless him. But most of us, to be honest, we're not at that point. We have so much more we need to learn, so much more we need to develop into. well, all kinds of things that we need to experience and to open ourselves up to experience. That was another part of the New Testament versus Old Testament. In the Old Testament, do something wrong, God will punish and kill you. New Testament, God appreciates the prodigal son who went out and experienced everything they could possibly experience in earthly life, even though some of it was considered to be, oh, that's not good. The fact that they experienced everything, when they came back to the Father in the prodigal son parable, they were appreciated more than the son who never went out and experienced anything. So I'll leave you with this one idea then. We have to be very careful about having a caricatured idea of spiritual development that is linked to what in the Rosicrucian work is called premature purification. Premature purification is where you start not experiencing everything you could experience in the world. You don't work through all of your emotional, sexual, whatever. And you're just like, I'm going to just clean and purify everything right now, get up to a very high state of spiritual attainment. And you can do that. And you'll develop some higher states through this. But the problem is when you get put in certain situations, because you didn't fully work through your adolescent conflicts in your emotional body and your sexual development or whatever else, it's going to come out as a pathology. And we found that in spades, for example, in the 1960s, when the Indian gurus began to come to the U.S., and many of them were authentically very advanced and had all types of siddhas and powers and abilities, and they could do transmissions. There's no question about that. But we shouldn't have the naive idea that just because a person has some level of spiritual development, that they're 100% perfect. It doesn't work that way. And so we then found that some of the teachers that were coming over from the East had done premature purification. Yes, they had developed some parts of their structure very, very advanced levels, but they started to sexually manipulate their students, one after another, because they had not properly worked through their emotional body, their sexual forces, all those types of things. So I'm going to leave that with people too, as part of a realistic estimation of how far advanced are we on the path. It doesn't mean, oh, well, stop all experience and exploration of earthly life to try to get there as fast as possible. You're going to get there through experiencing everything in earthly life. When things fall away naturally, you no longer have any attraction to it, you've worked through it, then yeah, you're ready to move on. But until you have experienced it and moved through it, you probably need to invest a little more time in your prodigal son or daughter path to get to that state. So that's what I would leave you with today.
For any of those that are inclined like me, checking out vesica.org, one of the hardest things is looking at the smorgasbord of courses that are available to you. You have truly dedicated so much of your life to this work, Robert. I have to. It's my pleasure to thank you for today's conversation, and yet it's not just today's conversation. You know, by the sounds of this conversation, it's this lifetime's work, but it's also multiple lifetimes' work. You, for what you're standing for, what you're sharing, and just so abundantly sharing with us. And for me personally, just the freedom within which it's not, the dogmas aren't attached to the wisdom and the knowledge is just, it's beyond refreshing. It's incredibly inspiring and inviting. I highly encourage people to check out vesica.org. And man, thank you so much, Robert, for just sharing yourself so abundantly here with us today. There is so much left to be asked. I've got questions around siddhas, nettas, your definition of the impulse, what's going on in the Giza and the point there, and more about Ibrahim Kareem. So maybe if you'd grace us again another time, potentially, that would be a blessing. But this was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for sharing yourself here with us today.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. I'd be happy to come back to get deeper into these topics. I've really enjoyed the exchange. And like I say, when people come to the website, they often see there's a lot of different things there. But I'd always try to simplify it, that if you want to work on the spiritual science aspect, start with Essential Teachings and Practices of Spiritual Science. If you want to start on the vibrational path, then one of the things I often recommend to people is to do our online course in Egyptian biogeometry, the foundation training. This opens up whole vast new worlds for people, and they're really good entry points for a lot of the more advanced explorations in different directions, including more advanced levels of biogeometry. It's interesting that you mentioned that with Dr. Kareem talking about that, because we're actually bringing him to North America later this year, which is a very rare event to offer even more advanced things. So we have the foundation and advanced trainings online, which prepare people for understanding what this is really about. So again, thank you so much for having me today. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to being with you in the future.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey there, Inspired Soul. You made it all the way through to the end of another episode. This particular conversation, Robert J. Gilbert, was beyond profound. I'd love to hear from you in the comments section below what you're taking away from this particular episode. And please, as mentioned earlier, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps everything that we're doing here around the Inspired Evolution. The whole channel is powered and empowered by your subscription. This is you powering the conversations that are happening here. Now, on screen now are 3 more conversations. One of them is with Robert Edward Grant, and it's going to be an incredible conversation about ancient Egypt and the technology, sacred geometry, similar to the flavor of the conversation we had here today, and another 2 conversations on screen for you to take your pick and continue your journey further. Stay inspired, keep evolving. I'll see you in the next one.